I think we can slowly start. Um, Thank you everyone for joining today for this amazing talk and our amazing guest, Sakshi Ghai from University of Cambridge. My name is Maya Kulpata. I'm an assistant professor here at Durham University in social psychology, and I will be moderating the talk today. Just a short introduction. Our amazing speaker is currently finishing her PhD thesis at University of Cambridge, and she's looking into the impact of technology and psychology of technology generally in global south. And she's very excited to share her knowledge and her expertise and thinking about how to decolonize and diversify psychology and behavioral science in general. And I think these are the questions we've been all pondering lately, at least quite seriously, and we need advice on how to move on and how to think about it. Now, she will give a presentation. We will not, she asked for during the presentation not to address the questions then, but we will have plenty of time, at least half an hour, to discuss all the questions after the presentation. Just a couple of rules. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. There you can do it anonymously, you can reveal your identity as well, and you can also vote for each other's questions so they come up first. I will be monitoring both chat and Q&A, but please do it in the Q&A. And just a small reminder, this meeting will be recorded as well. And I will give floor now to
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you so much to the organizers of RIOT, Turi and John, for this kind invitation. I'm very excited to present some early thinking on sample diversity. So I'm going to first make sure my technology is working. Can you see my slides? Maya?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, this is great. Great. So in today's talk, I want us to reflect on whether we need to reimagine sample diversity in behavior science. And also I'll also consider whether our science is updating its definition of diversity in an increasingly globalized, multicultural, digitized world that we live in today. So to set the stage, I wanted to first problematize the challenge of sample diversity, then argue why the time has come to really rethink how we understand this diversity, and finally, not offer ways to address it, because I'm coming into the presentation with more questions than answers, but really think about why, as a field, we should be really hopeful about this problem. So the presentation is more or less a broad analysis of the field, combined with some of my observations and experiences doing interdisciplinary research in philosophy, anthropology, behavioral economics, management, psychology. So hopefully this talk presents a little bit of a roadmap into sample diversity. So let's dive straight in. But to do so, let's do a bit of time travel. So I want to take you back to the 1960s. So Daniel Schultz in 1969 argued that we cannot continue to base some 80% of our human subject data on college students and still call our science the science of human behavior. Now, Schultz raised the same concerns that we are grappling with today: issues of generalizability, the nature of cherry picking our samples. In fact, our over-reliance on homogeneous white undergrad samples has been sort of the recurring theme in both the 1960s and then early 1970s. And one scholar on the right-hand side, Dr. Smart, actually raised the white rat concern, and he concluded that male college students have become like a white rat of human experimentation, and therefore made calls to broaden the basis in which how we select our samples. Now, these scholars also argued that without external pressure from journal editors and grant agencies to mandate representative samples, we won't see a change anytime soon. And in fact, 50 years on, almost 50 years on, uh, the change they've envisioned is still a long time coming. As we've moved through time, the seminal work of Joe Henrich and colleagues have documented the extent of a narrow understanding of human species. The weird acronym, Western, educated, rich, industrialized, democratic, has contributed to a change by sensitizing the field on the importance of sample diversity, by calling into question the generalizability of our finding. It spurred a meaningful change, and it's made us think very deeply about the overrepresentation of these cultural outliers that Henrik and colleagues call weird. Since then, let's travel another 8 years into the future. Well, it's not really future, but it is. We've since then extended our understanding of samples, or expanded our samples to the rest of the global north. So, very nice paper, very nice review by Rad et al. In 2018 shows nicely how the blue countries represent the locations of 93% of studies that are published in psychological science in 2017. So, if we think about it, more than 90% of our studies published in psychological science comes from less than 15% of the world's population. Now, of course, this is a problem, but what's further a problem is that our theories that are already built on this small slice of humanity are not also suffer with a representative problem within these small regions. So naturally, the question is, if you're excluding millions and billions of people, what does this really mean for the rigor of our research? Now, of course, we know that representative samples are very important for building theory. But then how can psychology also in today's day and age stay relevant, solve some of these pressing global challenges, whether it's climate change or it's poverty? Let's now also travel back a few centuries before we actually begin to tackle the problem of sample diversity. And I want to discuss Charles Darwin here, the famous evolutionary biologist who in the 19th century, we all know this, proposed his famous theory of natural selection, which has been one of the most important theories in biology. First, I'd like to argue, not only did he come about this theory by taking a long voyage to the global south, South America, Galapagos, where he made important observations that helped him arrive at his theory of evolution, he also proposed that diversity is key to evolution. I thought that was really interesting, considering that biology is considered by all means a higher order science. And we can debate about that, but it is, in a lot of ways. And as an aside, I was trying to dig through the literature, I found an interesting anecdote. And to quote the words of Paul Rozin, the psychologist at University of Pennsylvania, he said that even Charles Darwin's theory of evolution would not be able to pass the criteria for publication in the Journal of Personality or Social Psychology. Why? Because it was informed largely on informed curiosity, on his observations. The so-called lack of empirical evidence may even make it question. So putting all of that in perspective, the question really is, what is it about psychology and generally behavior science that has made us move so slowly on the problem of diversity? In a lot of ways, psychology has made a lot of progress. We've debated whether we are a science. We have debated that. We've reformed our ethics. We've questioned our research practices. We've had a credibility revolution. We've generated awareness about the inherent biases that lead us astray, whether it's the weird bias, or it's the lack of large samples. We've also gone so forth today to talk about ways in which we can apply psychology to address contemporary social issues like economics. We've also considered that humans are cultural animals and really started to think about how culture plays into the role of into our understanding of human psychology. However, we are still largely Western driven. We are still largely global North driven. And this is not just a criticism, but it's a call to action for us to explore the new opportunity and really the wide expanse of opportunity that we have to expand our understanding. In fact, we are just at the beginning of scratching this metaphorical surface, and who knows, we have a whole ocean to discover and to really unlock the understanding of human race. But before we do that, let's start by first examining the efficacy of these diversity classifications that we use today to really understand sample diversity. And of course, the most popular one is weird and non-weird classification. Now, I want to say that it's inadvertently become a dichotomy. In the next few minutes, I also want to argue why this misperception of it being a weird and a non-weird is costly, and how these categories are quite distinct, but they also overlap in a lot of ways. If we go by just Western, Henrik's definition of Western, it includes Northwestern Europe, it includes British descent societies, which actually account for 8% of the world's population. It therefore paints almost 92% of the human species with one homogeneous non-Western brush. And that, I'd like to argue, flattens the understanding of human experience. So yes, we know we have to go a step further, address the lack of heterogeneity that is perhaps skewing our research landscape. But to further unpack this, what counts as weird? Is it a country? Is it a person? Is it a culture? To do this, let's break up the acronym just for a minute. So if we start with the word Western, the question really is Western just a euphemism for white populations living in Anglosphere and Northwestern Europe? What about the remaining parts of Europe like Italy and Greece, the southern regions of Europe? Are they weird? Are they non-weird? If we think about educated and rich together, do we assume that all non-weird societies like India, Kenya, Nigeria, Mexico are uneducated and poor? If we think about rich also, Eastern cultures like South Korea and Japan are quite advanced economies. So do they count as non-weird? We think about industrialized. What is actually small scale? And what is industrialized? Where are those really distinct? And then finally, democratic. Even democracies that have been long and thriving, some are considered flawed, some have authoritarian regimes. So how do we really parse out these differences and classify them under two distinct categories? To do so, let's reflect a little bit more on the efficacy of just the weird label. Now, I completely acknowledge that we do need some diversity classification, and we need some degree of reductionism that can help us simplify complex social categories and draw inferences from different populations. However, the weird currently might be force-fitting human diversity into neat boxes, if you will. So firstly, it's been very, very important as a first order approximation. It's been the cornerstone of the large scale drive to diversify samples. We often hear about, weird, non-weird samples, and, the sort of focus and the trend towards diversifying our samples is very much there. So we're acknowledging the lack of samples. We very much want to expand and include the ones that have been excluded. And then interestingly also, the weird acronym flipped the value hierarchy, which Professor Dan Harushka very elegantly puts that it traditionally labels those who've been on the top as weird to suggest how different and peculiar these groups are. But some other scholars have also argued that it could be a potential euphemism for white, like Elizabeth Clancy, who's an anthropologist, and it can evoke colonial sentiments. Some have also argued it's a backronym and not really an acronym. But we do know that the weird acronym in itself and just the weird categories don't really take into account the person level differences, race, income, caste, and we'll get into that in just a few slides, but also the meso level, so the country level, within country, and then across country. So now I'd like to walk us through why the time has come that we should rethink diversity. So why now, and and how really is the big $1 million question. But while we understand the need to lump categories together, how can we move beyond this acronym and ask, what sort of diversity are we studying? What are these inferences that we are drawing? So I pulled this image of a telescope because Joe Henrich uses the analogy of telescoping contrast, and I think it's very nice and elegant way to put it together. And I argue that the time has come to sharpen the lens of this telescope and increase its resolution, because weird was a great first order approximation of diversity. But in the world that we currently live in, we do need to build a more nuanced understanding. Now, the question naturally is why? Because today, a country or a subpopulation or a participant cannot be classified as just weird or non-weird anymore, because there are pockets of weirdness in weird and pockets of non-weirdness in weird. So as an example, middle class populations in Canada could come under the label of weird. However, indigenous populations in Canada could arguably come under the label non-weird. Therefore, calling them non-weird particularly is not very accurate and appropriate to advance our science. So these are really good dimensions, whether it's Western versus non-Western, rich versus poor, but they may not be so sharp today. And therefore, we need to go beyond the oversimplification and recognize the greater complexity. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think it's important to also think about how the exclusion of the person level differences, whether it's race, whether it's other identities like caste, actually limit the exclusion of these parameters, actually limit our ability to account for the variation, and actually poses a big challenge when we are thinking about theories or when we are thinking about scaling up our insights from our lab experiments. And here, this is not a preference for lumping and splitting our samples. And I think lumping and splitting is so interesting to think about when we think about samples, because one argument is if we go on splitting, we will actually reach n equals 1, which is not statistically viable. But then if we actually go on lumping, and in this kind of non-weird way, we might be actually inadvertently restricting our potential to produce rich insights into human nature. And I'm very cognizant that we can't, just the way science is, we can't consider every factor. So we can't consider ecological, genetic, sociological, it'll take a lot of time to build all of that. But still, understanding whether the non-weird lumping is helping us or restricting us is the question I want to leave you with as we move. Next is that the weird also misses the within and across country variation. So when we think about between countries, Western and non-Western is a nice unit of analysis, and it's a first step. The second step is between countries, right? So let's take example of, say, Korea. North Korea, which is considered non-weird because it's underdeveloped, while South Korea is very developed. So would that also be non-weird? How do we lump these two populations together without acknowledging that they're very, very different contextually? Further, we also need to appreciate the within country variation, so the intra-population differences at the person level. So for example, let's take the example of a country in Africa, Nigeria. So rich and educated people there, would they be considered non-weird? And how different are they to indigenous populations in Canada? Or even immigrants in Canada, say first generation and then second generation. how how different it is. And as I'm sort of talking through this, you can pick up on the fact that cultural variation is really hard and it's really messy to capture, and it becomes even more so in the era that we live in today, with the rate of technological progress that we have. As I said, the world has become more globalized, it's become more digitized, more multicultural, and therefore it's important to think about the parameters and dimensions that constitute or define a population. So, how are we defining a population? And even that changes with time, and especially in today, the massive societal changes around us, whether it's immigration or other changes, require us to look at how the non-weird category may be actually obstructing us a little bit. And further, we're also stepping out of a world where previously understood binary definitions of diversity is changing. So very simple: gender. Gender was of course once male, female. Today it's trans, it's cis, it's agender. In fact, just yesterday, the US issued the first passport with X as a gender marker. And I think it all goes to show that, to ensure that we are evolving and promoting a fair and accurate representation of human race, we also have to update our definition of sample diversity. But how much do we really need to think? Because it seems like we have to rethink a lot. And here, I just want to present you with this iceberg that is actually missing a lot of things. So this is just a sort of visual to illustrate that actually the problem that we're trying to solve may be just of diversity and diversity of our samples. And really, if we want to be problem focused, we need to, hone in on, okay, how do we get people from the tail ends of the distribution to a normal distribution where we are including everybody. So that's the big problem. But underneath the surface, it opens up sort of a Pandora's box of other considerations, whether our theory is relevant, what are the ethical bottlenecks, what are the infrastructural barriers, how are we capturing linguistic diversity, are our incentives in the field aligned, how are journals recognizing it, and so on and so forth. So you can very quickly start to see how we need to rethink a lot. And I know that's overwhelming. It's certainly very overwhelming for me. But then how do we really begin to rethink diversity? And that's the question I want to focus the next 10 minutes or so on. And then I'd love to sort of get your thoughts and open up for a bit more discussion. In my effort to think about how we can rethink diversity, I came across this quote by Maslow, Abraham Maslow, which really stuck with me, which is, I suppose it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. And apparently this is called Maslow's golden hammer, which is described as a cognitive bias that involves that we often over rely on familiar tools. And I think if we take this analogy of over reliance on a familiar tool, then the question to first start asking is, what is the current, like, what are the familiar tools currently in behavior science? Is it our theory? Is it our methods? Is it our samples? Is it what? And sort of really start to think about that. But the broader question to ask here is, how can we make sure that science is accurately capturing diversity, but not just diversity for diversity's sake, but also to benefit humanity? So we can't ignore culture and context here in our need to sort of find and replicate universal effects. So here I'd like to argue that we do need to do a little bit of a diversity audit to really understand what diversity means, very simply. And the reason being that our understanding of diversity, as in where it stands today, might be missing important dimensions. So let's take Global South, for example, or even the non-weird label. that in itself is incredibly diverse. So to put a label like global south non-weird under one category is, it's also very hard to accurately capture the extent of human diversity under this one label. So we do need to urgently ask researchers and scholars from different diverse groups to chime in, to weigh in, to help us develop this nuanced understanding, especially the overlooked categories of diversity in different parts of the world. And just as an example, you can see India highlighted. From India, I grew up there, and the salient identities while I was growing up, well, one was for sure gender, and it still continues to be, but other salient identities like caste and religion are not well represented in behavior science and psychology. The argument is equally, we may find that in other parts, whether it's Latin America, Africa, we might find other overlooked dimensions. Could be sexual orientation, could be digital access, could be indigenous groups. And these all have important implications for human behavior. Not all of human behavior, but certainly some. So, for example, caste, religion, for example, is very important to understand positive group relations in a country like India, which is very diverse religiously. And to further complicate this, at a person level, there is intersectionality. There are different identities that intersect and overlap. So there's sexual orientation, there's culture, there's religion, there's uh, cultural traits, there's caste, social class, regional diversity, urban versus rural, and I'm sure I'm missing many, many, many more important identities in this visual here. But I think it points to the fact that intersectionality and the inter sort of connected nature of our social categories makes human diversity on a continuum. So and then further, there are different forms of diversity. So there's social, there's cognitive, there's linguistic, which makes diversity very, very complex and very, very multifaceted. Second is we might need to also review our research process. And this is slightly moving away from just the typology of diversity and moving into how we do research and how we think about research to be able to promote this accurate representation. And just as an example, we know that we need to expand our method toolkits, because we struggle with generalizability in cross-cultural research, because often we take validated scales and apply it from one context to the other, and that is problematic in a lot of ways. We assume some constructs can very much translate into some languages, so there's differences in social norms, and we can sort of go on. But this paper by Daniel Hirishka actually really nicely points and shows the need to expand our toolkit if we really want to do research outside of the Western context. And further, and again, this is just a visual or a way for us to think about at what different dimensions of our research process should we pay attention to sample diversity. So first, at the conceptualization stage, are we really considering social, cultural, geographical aspects when we form these questions? Or are we just taking a question and just trying to find sort of universal effects? Theoretical bias, which again points to the fact that if we have been missing 88% of the world's populations, are we really sure that the psychology theory and behavior science theory is where it stands? And that's the perfect sort of model, or are there new theories that we might discover once we sort of go into this into these contexts? Then research methods, and here again, are we using interdisciplinary methods like combining ethnography with some of these quantitatives? How are we thinking about ecological validity? How are we leveraging big data revolution as data and internet and mobile phones is really reaching the remotest corners of the world and soon, will, at least in the next 10 years or so, it's projected to reach at least cover like 2/3 of the global south, if I'm not getting that statistic wrong. Then moving into ethics, often ethics is it's sort of a overlooked aspect of research process when it comes to doing diverse research, because there are lots of bottlenecks when it comes to ethics, and there are lots of barriers, both in terms of time of ethical approval, but also in terms of sensitivity to data, to privacy, to understanding, what and how. Is there even an ethics checklist for doing this kind of work outside of Western norms? Then at the stage of data collection, how can we pay attention to how our data is collected? Of course, online, offline, representative, convenient, student, disadvantage. And again, here we have lots of research that shows that even within the global north, we often tend to rely on convenient samples or student samples, and that is also doing a bit of a disservice, because that is again not capturing everybody in the small slice of the science. And then more importantly, what elements of diversity are we capturing? So the study demographics, we know that age and gender often get captured, but race, income, education might not be given as much weight, or at least has not been given till yet, although that is changing. And then finally, at the data analysis stage, how do we think about updating our preference for splitting, lumping? How can we make sure we are tying findings to the population? And this doesn't really cover the research process, but this is just to illustrate the complexity of doing cross-cultural research, which requires us to sort of go beyond what we know, and go beyond how we do the research. And finally, I'd like to argue that if we really want to move the needle on sample diversity, it's not possible without the help from diverse scientists. In fact, there's so much information asymmetry to even enter the world of science if you come from low-income country, that we need to make sure that we're including diverse perspectives in the conversation on diversity. I think that is definitely very, very key. And to make sure really that we are capturing world's majority of the population. This is just a quick cartogram to show you how big countries like India and China are, and how many billions are we actually truly capturing. Are we truly capturing? And finally, I'd like to say that if we really want to make our science more inclusive, go global, we have to go hyper-local and adopt a more culturally sensitive perspective in recruiting our samples. And that, of course, starts with collaborations, but that also means we need to focus more on culture and context. So as I conclude this talk, I just want to quickly say that this is intended for me and for us to have a more collective conversation and really start asking the questions of who are the people that are still cultural outliers, and how can we include them? Because without sample diversity, we won't really be able to advance the science of human behavior. But also to say that the way the field, it's remarkable how the field has really taken up the challenge of reproducibility and open science. And really in the last 10 years, we've changed our incentives, changed pretty much everything at the institution level, at the social norms level, at the way we are training scientists now. So how can we also include diversity in the same revolution is something that we would love to think more about. All right, I'm going to stop the screen share, and I'd love to hear comments, questions, concerns, and yeah, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sakshi. We already have a first question for you. So do you think there are broad categories which are the most important for us to hone in first? and then be aware of subcategories? And moreover, do you think transparency in our sampling is a good first step, even if we can't do better sampling?
I love that question. I really, really like that question because I think transparency, and I'll start with transparency first. It's both transparency and intellectual humility are such an important aspect of including diversity. So, when we think about our research papers and we think about sort of where we often find references to samples or the challenge of samples, it's often in the limitation sections of each paper. And right there, if we are signaling that this is a non-weird quote unquote sample, then the methods needs to reflect that. And if it's relying on English speaking educated middle class population, then that's not really non-weird. So if so but that's also important because it's important to get the diversity from a different region. So I'm not saying that's not important. Just calling it non-weird is probably not accurate. So we do need more transparency. And at this point, at the rate at which we are currently, where we have marginalized about 88% of the world's population, we have to start somewhere. And of course, starting somewhere does mean that even if we do, and even if we rely on online ways to recruit samples, which is convenient, we should do that, and we should not do that, but we should also make an effort to include the non-English speaking and the hard to reach populations. So I think transparency is absolutely key, and I think that's the bit that will help us go from that will be the first step in building this nuanced understanding. That is the first step. Yeah, not sure if that answered your question.
It did. Okay. So we have a second question. Julie asks, can you please expand on your last point with diverse scientists? You spend a lot of time talking, explaining the non-weird is often rather restrictive. How should we then see diverse scientists and how to approach in including them?
Sorry, I was on mute. Of course, I was on mute. Sorry, could you just repeat the last bit? I couldn't catch.
So how should we see diverse scientists, and how should we go about approaching diverse scientists?
Wow, this is a this is a whole other conversation. But I don't know if I have answers to this specifically, but I do think that the reason diverse perspectives, the reason and it's not me, I think there's a lot of folks who have talked about the way to solve sample diversity is really through researcher diversity. That's the quickest way, that's the fastest way. You get diverse perspectives, you get scientists from different parts of the world, they might look into the problems from their respective regions. And there again, the question is, okay, but then why should the onus then lie on diversity on diverse scientists, which is another kind of not problem, but another feature of diversity. But here, I think what's important is that one is, we include diverse scientists, and that's just purely representation. So, even within the North, making sure sort of people from different ethnicities are included, but then also from low income countries and so on and so forth. But then also making sure that these scientists stay in the science, and not wither away, but like not leave due to different infrastructural barriers. So I think that's a completely different problem. but I think both go very much hand in hand. And I think from the world of science, if we can truly start thinking about how to include, how to make sure scientists feel like diverse scientists feel like they really belong, and it's and also they can contribute to this conversation even on diversity, that they have the um, I want to say the word right to contribute to the conversation, whether it's diversity or other. It's just something, yeah, to make sure. But another thing I just want to add on this, is that it's also important to ensure that if even if we are collaborating from scholars from around the world, it's ensuring that they are included properly, like they're not. Um, it's that we go beyond tokenism to truly include their perspectives and truly value. But yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't think I've spent that much time thinking on that. So that's a note to me.
Thank you. I just wanted to note what you said. I feel, especially last year with the pandemic, there has been a surge in, let's say, collaborations quite a bit, but they are usually led by scientists in the West, basically borrowing others' access to data they didn't have before. So I think your point really reflects that we should rethink how those collaborations are done, because they're not always respective of the other side. There is another question by Sarah. She says, you discussed Heinrich et al. Article early in the talk. Heinrich and Norazain, I'm not sure how to pronounce, have published widely in the psychology of religion. From what I'm aware, the psychology of religion is trying to both diversify, so move away from Christianity as a focus, while also focusing on hyper-specific localized differences in religion. Due to the nature of the subdiscipline, looking at one of the axes versus religion, they may have an advantage. How would one go in a less specific subdiscipline such as psychobiology, cognitive neuroscience?
Wow, this is a very, very deep and very thoughtful question. So thank you, Sarah. I think very instinctively, and this is something that I've been thinking about, which is that you can't, if you think about the sort of the intersectionality visual that I presented a few slides ago, you can't really capture all of that, right? Or the question is, do we really need to capture all of that? It depends on our research questions. It depends on what we're trying to understand. So is there such a thing as does it make sense to even do a little bit of a baseline in psychology in the different subfields to really map and understand what are the different dimensions of diversity that are important for the way we make our inferences? So just as an example, in cognitive neuroscience, or at least the early childhood development, like it's really important, I would imagine, to get, say, the income of both the child and the parents, to get the income of parents. So something like that is obviously very, very specific to a subfield. It's specific to the question. So I think to get at your answer, we also need to do another review, another rethink on trying to go down each of these disciplines and trying to understand what are the elements and dimensions of the samples demographic that speak directly to the research question and that speak to the findings, and particularly sort of clinical psychology, because clinical psychology is a very, very applied science. So there, even the most, I believe Hall in 1997, I'm not remembering their first name, but they said that even in a field like clinical psychology, where any problem or any sort of research question that you address has some element of applied to it, that you often have to do a little bit of a baseline.
So Ayana asks, well, thanks for the interesting talk. And it reiterates quite a lot of what the original WIRD paper also, and what it follows up, has been saying. Given that the message seems to be easily lost, what is the best way to get this message to stick in psychology? And which is so tied up in categorizing everything in discrete boxes, which is the real problem.
Gosh, these are amazing questions. I'm going to screenshot all of them. Yeah, I think it's really hard to make the problem of sample diversity stick, and I think the WIRD acronym has done it so well. It's that acronym itself, the tool, I think Henrik and colleagues often say it's a consciousness raising tool. They do recognize the limitation, and they often say it's a consciousness raising tool. And I think that by itself has already moved the field forward. I don't know if we need to reboot WIRD, or if we need another version of another acronym. But I think I like to come at the fundamental problem of what will it take for psychology or behavior science to really sort of solve this intention action problem, or this intention action gap, that we recognize we need to solve this problem of diversity. We've been trying for couple of decades. Today there's a lot of awareness. People are very conscious, they are very committed. But I think this, not the solution, but a possible way, is to be able to tie the opportunity of advancing the science and including these diverse samples to actually making psychology more effective. So making the case for diversity beyond just the optics, and to say that, if we really want to solve some of these big problems, we need more inclusive science, is my, yeah, that would be my intuition. Yeah, though if you come up with with a clever acronym, that would be really cool.
So Kathleen is asking, how can we help take down barriers for non-WIRD colleagues to become truly equal collaborators?
Yeah, there are so many barriers, so I don't know which one to start with. I think one thing I have to say that I have been very struck by, and kudos to all the psychology departments and behavior science generally departments that are doing this, is and especially, I mean, I did my undergrad in India, and it took me a couple of years to build up my research portfolio, or to build up my portfolio to even have a shot at a PhD. So all to say that there's a lot of information asymmetry that I had I known the things that I know today, or the things that I can advise to younger scientists who want to, or folks in India or folks in other parts of the global south who want to enter the science, had I known that, it would have been very different. So I think the push towards diversifying the departments, and the initiatives that universities and departments are spearheading today, just to break this information symmetry, is like the first big barrier. And completely, I'm, especially in the last 1 year, not thanks to the pandemic, but like because of the way the world has changed, I think that is certainly one very, very important step to enable the entry into science, or just the entry into science, because a lot of the universities have different barriers. The other bit is around capacity building. So often these regions in the global south, India, Africa, they don't have the resources, neither do they have the sort of the mental bandwidth, because there are so many bigger problems to solve in these regions, um, that they don't really have the resources to dispense and think, okay, I'm going to do science for science sake. So I think capacity building and infrastructure and equitable distribution of resources is obviously the barrier for people to come. But the third, which I'm going to focus on, like I focused on things that the infrastructure barriers that are very hard to solve at an individual level. Of course, collectively and institutionally, one can solve it. Um, but the one thing that again I'm seeing a lot of push in the field, which is very exciting, is to be able to sort of spread awareness about how helicopter research. I think Nature did a piece couple of months ago on how to end helicopter research and really start to equally get people into the collaboration. So you're not just flying into a country and just collecting the data without actually including, because often these scientists actually have the cultural know-how to interpret those results. So I think that is also, and I'm sure there are so many more that we can keep thinking about and come up with. But I think the consciousness and awareness is the first step, and it's very exciting to see the field push and move the needle on that.
Sarah has a follow-up to her question. Um, so is your response to suggest we need to understand if our knowledge of baseline effects, such as response time changes after intake of X amount of caffeine, are different across different sub-ethnicities, genders, and then use this baseline within our particular subfield to inform future questions, interpretations of data?
So again, Sarah, you're asking very, very thoughtful questions that definitely I don't think I have the exact answer for, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So I think the point about understanding which affect, whether it's coffee intake, whether it's time, whatever X variable, how does that affect say Y, in our need to take that and apply it across different contexts and different subgroups and different ethnicities. uh, the question to ask is whether we need a bottoms up or no, bottoms down, or yeah, like a bottoms up or a bottoms down approach, if I'm not wrong. Which is that, where do we start, right? So do we start at the population level and try and understand the problems that there are in a particular region? So if I think about North India, where I'm from, if we are trying to solve the problem of, or if we are trying to understand better why gender norms are so sticky in these regions, um, and then sort of build our research question and our designs, our methods, that's a very sort of different direction versus like a more bottom up, where we are taking something like a bias and then taking that to then customizing it to a certain population, and then that might mean different methods and so on and so forth. So I think I think the point I'm trying to make, which I'm not making very articulately, is that it depends on the approach. But yes, to your point, using those as baselines within particular fields, I don't know which one should follow the other. I think the baseline of where we are just helps as a starting point, which is why I would sort of, my intuition would be to do it the other way, to start with a baseline of both understanding what particular fields, but then what is our definition of diversity, what particular fields need to care about which kinds of diverse identities, and then simultaneously how do we sort of reflect that on our methods, on our just generally our research process. So I'm not sure if that's a satisfactory answer, but yeah.
We have a couple of more minutes at the moment. Sarah, thanks a lot for the responses, and she says it's definitely of interest to her, and I think just having these discussions is important.
Well, thank you, RIOT, and thank you for having me and for giving me the opportunity to discuss some of these ideas. I know I didn't present any data, but hopefully the conceptual bits got us to do a little bit of rethinking.
I was thinking with the last thing that I got me thinking of all of this is, for instance, there was a response, I feel like, in the journals about the reproducibility and open science, right? You now get all the badges. And that could be performative or anything, but at least it's consciously there that we somehow reward this. Do you think rewarding actually and saying, hey, you get a badge for actually doing the work and sampling diverse and thinking about it in your research from diverse would make, or could be, for instance, a way to get journals around it a little bit, to reward and to show that we are rewarding people who do this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a really nice idea. In fact, I think Rad et al. in their 2018 PNAS paper also talked about diversity badges, and they have like very interesting recommendations for authors, for journals. And I know a lot of journals have changed their mandates and are making sure that they are accounting for diversity and paying attention to diversity. But I don't think I've actually seen a diversity badge. That would be really cool. I think that would be really cool. Also, I think the reason it will be really cool is that doing diverse research, and especially with a low income country focus or in a different context, and it just takes a lot more time, from start to finish. So like ethics can sometimes take up to a couple of months. Yeah, it can take quite some time. And then, you have to think about sort of the research not just as an experiment. You also have to think about it as a project that you're managing, because there are different stakeholders. You have typically partners on the ground, enumerators you have to train. You're collaborating with very different people. You're trying to make sure it's culturally relevant. You're doing translations, you're transcribing, from from English to another language, then back. So there are so many different aspects of cross-cultural research that require a lot of time. And I think that for that people should get badges, not not just for diverse research. I would love for everybody to do diverse research, but I think that time, and particularly like large scale experiments, take quite a bit of time. So often they get, the publication time differs, and that's why, that's where that has implications if you are thinking about your career as a scientist, because then, you might not sort of, you might have something in the making for a couple of years but not really have something to show. So I think it again brings back the question of diverse badges or performative or virtue signaling back to the question of incentives and norms of the field, which I really truly believe are changing, or at least there is an appetite to have this conversation. And I'm so grateful to be doing this kind of research in 2021, or just now, because we have the space to have these conversations, and truly sort of look at science and moving the field forward.
There is a follow-up question asking whether the badge approach is ethical, and isn't that rewarding something that should be the norm?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. But again, we have to start somewhere. If we are rewarding open science, and we always sort of mention open science, this study was pre-registered on da 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 date in all of our papers, then we can surely squeeze in a sentence or two highlighting diversity. Badge or no badge, like, I think it's about sort of how we reflect the diversity of the sample, and how do we sort of transparently communicate that. And yeah, I think for the hard to reach, for sure, it would be cool to have some sort of a badge to signal that this is a hard to reach, just because hard to reach is so hard to reach, even in the north. It's not just the global south. So I think that would be cool. But yeah, point taken.
There is one more question. I think we can let you go. It says, what would an alternative approach to sample diversity be targeting and generalizing to a smaller population when conducting research?
So, sorry, could you repeat that?
Would an alternative approach to sample diversity be targeting and generalizing to a smaller population when conducting research?
Yeah, that could be certainly a way. I think there are just so many different approaches and different ways we can take. Even starting like I'm currently in the UK, and even starting here with subpopulations is certainly a step forward. So yeah, I think we can be creative in our way and our different approaches, to move the needle on diversity, because even if it's a small step, it's a very meaningful step, regardless.
Thank you so much, Sakshi. Again, thank you all to all the attendees for wonderful questions and a great discussion. And I think we all have quite a lot to ponder and think about how we do. So I think this ends this meeting. And we hope to at some point also have you here in person as a guest to kind of continue this important discussion, because as you said, this is just the start of really, getting on the bandwagon, really starting to rethink our field and rethink how we do our work.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you so much, RIOT Club, for having me. This has been really fun. Thank you.
Thank you.